The silence in our old family home had never been so loud. It was a thick, suffocating blanket, heavier than all the years I had spent within those walls. Just moments before, the air had been crackling with the sharp, cruel sound of my mother's voice, words that had sliced through the quiet dignity of our Sunday dinner like a butcher's knife. Now, there was only the hum of the refrigerator and the frantic, painful thumping of my own heart. I stared down at my plate, at the cooling roast beef and the potatoes I had so carefully prepared, and I saw not a meal, but the wreckage of my life. I was 58 years old, and I had just been told to get out of the only home I had ever truly known. My name is Clara, and for 30 years, my world had been confined to the four walls of that house in a quiet suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. It wasn't the life I had planned. In my youth, my dreams were painted in vibrant greens and brilliant floral hues. I was studying botany with a passion for cultivating rare orchids. I imagined a life filled with greenhouses, humid air thick with the scent of damp earth and exotic blossoms. I had a small scholarship, a tiny apartment near the university, and a future that felt like a seed, just waiting for the right conditions to sprout. Then came the phone call that changed everything. My father, a kind, gentle man with a laugh that could fill a room, had suffered a massive stroke. He survived, but he was a shadow of his former self, needing constant, round-the-clock care. My mother, Eleanor, was a woman built of fine china and brittle pride. She was not equipped, emotionally or physically, for the grueling reality of being a caregiver. My brother, Mark, was already married and building a career in finance 2 states away. He sent money, of course. Money was always Mark's solution, but he didn't send his time. So I came home. I told myself it was temporary. I'd take a semester off, help my mother get a system in place, and then I'd return to my orchids. But a semester turned into a year. The system was me. My father's needs grew, and my mother's fragility seemed to deepen with every passing day. The promise I made to my father in the quiet of his sick room, his hand frail in mine, became the silent contract that defined my existence. "I'll look after Mom, Dad," I had whispered. "Don't you worry." He had squeezed my hand, a flicker of relief in his tired eyes, and I had sealed my fate. He passed away 5 years later. By then, my scholarship had long since expired. My friends from university had moved on, their lives branching out in directions I could only imagine. My world had shrunk to doctor's appointments, prescription refills, and the rhythm of my mother's moods. Eleanor wasn't a monster. Not then. But she was a woman steeped in a quiet bitterness, a resentment for the hand life had dealt her. And I, as the constant fixture in her life, became the vessel for all her frustrations. The years bled into one another, a watercolor painting of muted grays and beiges. I managed the household, I did the shopping, I tended the garden my father had loved, I cooked the meals, I paid the bills from her and my father's accounts. I was the chief operating officer of our little 2-person world. My own savings, a small nest egg from a part-time job in college, had been absorbed into the household expenses years ago, a fact that was never acknowledged. I lived in my childhood bedroom. I wore clothes that were 10, 15 years out of style. I had no career, no pension, no life of my own. I had only my purpose, to care for Eleanor. The tension began to truly fray about a year before that final dinner. Mark, on one of his rare visits, sat with Mother at the dining table, spreadsheets and bank statements spread before them. I was in the kitchen washing dishes, but their voices carried. Mark spoke of trimming expenses, of long-term financial planning. I heard my name mentioned, followed by a hushed conversation. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I was an expense to be trimmed. After Mark left, a new edge entered my mother's voice. Small things at first. "Did you really need to buy the expensive brand of coffee, Clara, or the heating bill is astronomical? You must be turning it up when I'm asleep." Every grocery receipt was scrutinized. Every dollar I spent on the household was questioned. The unspoken truth was that her widow's pension and my father's savings were finite. The market had taken a downturn, and fear had taken root in her heart, a fear that was quickly turning into a corrosive resentment directed at me. I tried to talk to her. I tried to suggest I could get a part-time job, something to contribute, to ease her mind. And who would be here if I fell? She'd snap back, her voice sharp. Who would make my lunch? At your age, with no skills, what kind of job could you possibly get anyway? Each word was a small, precise stab, aimed at the most vulnerable parts of me. My age, my lack of a career, my dependence. A dependence she herself had cultivated and demanded. And so we arrived at that final Sunday. Mark was on the phone earlier in the day, his voice a smooth, confident baritone in mother's ear. I heard snippets. Fiscal responsibility, tough decisions, can't be a safety net forever. He was poisoning her mind from a safe distance, absolving himself of any real responsibility. Dinner was tense. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to be counting down to something. I tried to make small talk, mentioning that the hydrangeas in the garden were about to bloom. My mother just stared at me, her gaze cold. "Clara," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "Mark and I have been talking." I put my fork down. My hands felt clammy. "Oh, this arrangement, it can't continue," she said, not looking at me, but at a point on the wall just over my shoulder. "I'm not getting any younger. My financial situation is precarious." "I know, Mother," I said softly. "I do my best to be careful with the money." A short, bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Your best? Your best is living here for free for 30 years. Your best is costing me a small fortune. I've raised one child. I'm done. This isn't a charity." The words hung in the air, thick and toxic. I take care of you," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "I do everything. The house, the garden, the cooking. This is my home." That's when she finally looked at me, her eyes, once so full of life, now just cold, hard stones. "No, Clara. This is my home. You are a tenant who has not paid rent for 3 decades. The free ride is over." She pushed her chair back, the legs scraping against the wood floor. Her voice rose, shaking with a strange, theatrical fury. "I am not your bank anymore. Get out. Get out." 2 words. They detonated in the quiet dining room, shattering the fragile peace I had so carefully curated for decades. They echoed off the walls that held my entire history, my sacrifices, my unspoken grief. My brother wasn't there to see the fallout. My father wasn't there to defend me. It was just me and the woman I had given my life to, who was now casting me out like a piece of old, unwanted furniture. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. A strange, chilling calm washed over me. The pain was so immense, so absolute, that it transcended tears. It was a deep, internal severance. I felt the cord that had bound me to her, to that house, to that life, snap. I looked at her, her face flushed, her chest heaving. She looked triumphant and terrified all at once. I simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. I stood up from the table. I didn't clear my plate. I left the remnants of my last meal in that house to grow cold. I walked past her, out of the dining room, and up the familiar, creaking stairs to my childhood bedroom. The room that had been my sanctuary and my prison. And as I closed the door behind me, I knew I would not spend another night under that roof. She had yelled at me to get out. So I would. But I would do it in a way that neither she, nor my brother, nor anyone could have ever expected. I wasn't just leaving a house. I was about to find out if there was anything left of Clara to save. The small, worn suitcase I owned had been stored in the back of my closet for decades, a relic from a life I'd almost forgotten I'd ever planned to live. Its full leather sides were cracked, and it smelled faintly of mothballs and lost time. As I placed it on my bed, the floral bedspread I'd had since I was a teenager seemed to mock me with its cheerful, faded pattern. There wasn't much to pack. My clothes were practical, not plentiful. I folded a few sweaters, several pairs of sensible trousers, and the undergarments that were all I ever bought new for myself. I packed my toothbrush and the single, expensive face cream a friend had gifted me for my 50th birthday, a gift I had used so sparingly it was still half full. Every object I touched felt heavy with memory. The worn copy of Pride and Prejudice on my nightstand, its spine broken, its pages soft as cloth. The small, silver locket my father had given me for my 21st birthday, with a microscopic picture of him and me inside. I tucked them both into the side pocket of the suitcase. These were the only things that felt truly mine. Everything else, the furniture, the pictures on the walls, the very air I was breathing belonged to the house to her. I was an intruder, a ghost who had overstayed her welcome. I didn't make a sound. I moved with a deliberate quietness that was born of years of tiptoeing around my mother's moods. I could hear the television droning downstairs, a laugh track playing out a comedy in a world that felt universes away from mine. She was already moving on, filling the silence I had left behind. The thought didn't hurt anymore. It was just a fact. The severance was complete. I had a little over $400 in my purse, cash I had painstakingly saved over years, squirreling away $10 or $20 here and there from the grocery money, a secret fund for a rainy day I never truly believed would come. It felt like both a pittance and a fortune. It was all I had in the world. With my suitcase in one hand and my purse over my shoulder, I walked down the stairs. I didn't look at the family photos on the wall, Mark's perfect wedding, his smiling children, the formal portraits where I stood slightly to the side, a permanent supporting character. I walked to the front door, my hand hovering over the brass knob. For a moment, a wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over me. Where would I go? What would I do? I was a 58-year-old woman with a 30-year gap in her resume and a few $100s to her name. The world outside this door was a vast, terrifying unknown. But the alternative, staying, begging, swallowing the jagged pills of my mother's cruelty, was impossible. My pride, a forgotten and shriveled thing, had somehow been reawakened. It was small, but it was fierce. It whispered to me that staying would be a kind of death. Leaving was just a risk. I opened the door and stepped out into the cool Ohio night. The scent of the blooming hydrangeas I had mentioned at dinner filled the air, a final, poignant farewell from the garden I had so lovingly tended. I did not look back. I closed the door gently behind me, the click of the latch sounding like a final, definitive period at the end of a very long and painful chapter. I walked to the end of the street and sat on the bench at the bus stop, the lone suitcase beside me like a silent companion. The streetlight cast a lonely yellow glow. I didn't know the bus schedule. I didn't know where it went. I just knew it went away. When the bus finally arrived, its headlights cutting through the darkness, I climbed aboard without a destination in mind. I paid my fare and sat by a window, watching the familiar suburban houses, each with its own story hidden behind glowing windows, slide by until they melted into the dark anonymity of the highway. I rode for hours, transferring from one bus to another, heading south, chasing a warmth I hadn't felt in years. Sometime before dawn, I found myself in a sprawling, impersonal bus terminal. A departures board listed dozens of cities and towns, names that meant nothing to me. My eyes scanned the list, feeling a strange sense of paralyzed freedom. I could go anywhere. I belonged nowhere. And then I saw it. A small town I'd never heard of, Port Blossom. It was a coastal town in North Carolina, the board said. Port Blossom. The name itself felt like a promise, a whisper of the botanist I once was. A place where things might bloom. It was as good a reason as any. I walked to the counter, my voice raspy from disuse, and bought a one-way ticket. The journey was a blur of greasy spoon diners, uncomfortable seats, and the endless scroll of the American landscape. I was invisible, just another older woman traveling alone. No one knew my story. No one knew the gaping wound I was carrying. That anonymity was a strange comfort. Arriving in Port Blossom was like stepping into a watercolor painting. The air was salty and thick, the sky a vast, pale blue. The town was small, with a main street lined with pastel-colored shops and a harbor where fishing boats bobbed gently on the tide. It was beautiful, but its beauty only highlighted my own desolation. I had less than $200 left. My first task was finding a place to live. The charming inns were out of the question. I found a notice board in the local post office and saw an ad for a room to rent. It was above a row of shops, a few blocks from the main street. The address led me to a narrow, rickety staircase next to a laundromat. The landlord was a gruff man who barely looked at me as he took my deposit and first week's rent, a significant chunk of my remaining cash. The room was tiny, smaller than my bedroom back in Ohio. It had a single bed with a lumpy mattress, a small, stained sink in the corner, and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. The shared bathroom was down a grim, linoleum-floored hallway. It was bleak. It was depressing. But it was mine. That first night, I lay on the lumpy mattress, the sounds of the laundromat thrumming below me, and I cried. I cried for the life I'd lost, for the comfort of my old bed, for the father who would have been horrified to see me like this. I cried for the foolish, hopeful girl who had believed in a promise, and for the old, tired woman she had become. The next morning, I woke up with swollen eyes and a fierce, desperate resolve. Crying was a luxury I couldn't afford. I needed a job. I walked up and down the main street, my heart sinking with every no experience necessary sign that was clearly aimed at teenagers. I walked into bakeries, cafes, gift shops, and grocery stores. The response was always the same, a polite but firm rejection. They saw my graying hair, the lines on my face, and they saw a liability. They saw someone who wasn't quick, who wasn't tech-savvy, who didn't fit. My mother's words echoed in my head. At your age, with no skills, what kind of job could you possibly get? For 2 weeks, I lived on cheap bread and instant coffee. My money dwindled to almost nothing. Desperation was a cold, physical ache in my stomach. I was on the verge of being truly homeless, a story you hear about but never imagine for yourself. One afternoon, defeated and exhausted, I found myself drawn to a small, cluttered shop at the far end of town. The sign above the door, hand-painted and faded, read Henderson's Pages. It was a second-hand bookstore. The windows were crammed with towering, leaning stacks of books. The smell that wafted out when a customer left was one of my favorite smells in the world: old paper, binding glue, and dust. It smelled like stories. I went inside, not as a job seeker, but just to breathe, to be in a place that felt safe. The interior was a labyrinth of shelves that reached the high ceilings. Books were everywhere, piled on chairs, spilling from boxes. Behind a massive wooden desk, surrounded by a fortress of literature, sat an old man with a cloud of white hair and glasses perched on the end of his nose. He looked up as the bell on the door chimed, and he gave me a small, kind smile. I spent an hour just wandering, running my fingers over the spines of books I hadn't thought about in years. It was a balm to my raw nerves. Finally, I picked out a thin volume of poetry and brought it to the desk. I had so little money, but I couldn't bear to leave empty-handed. "Just this one today?" the old man asked, his voice a gentle rumble. "Yes," I said. "It's all I can afford." The admission slipped out before I could stop it. He looked at me over the top of his glasses, his gaze discerning but not pitying. "Tough times?" I just nodded, my throat suddenly tight. He tapped a finger on the book. "Tell you what," he said. "I've been meaning to sort through that pile of new arrivals over there for a week now, but my back's been giving me fits. You help me sort them alphabetically by author, and we'll call it even for the book." Tears pricked my eyes. It was a small act, a simple exchange, but it was the first hand of kindness that had been extended to me since I'd arrived. "I can do that," I managed to say. So I spent the next 2 hours sitting on the floor of that dusty, magical bookstore, sorting books. We worked in comfortable silence for a while, and then he started to talk. His name was Arthur Henderson. He had owned the store for 40 years. He told me about his late wife, about the town, about the way the tides worked. He didn't ask me about my past. He just created a space for me to exist in the present. When I was done, he handed me the book of poetry. "You're good at this," he said. "You've got a gentle touch. These old books appreciate that." He paused, then said, "I could use some help a few hours a week. Just sorting, shelving, dusting. It wouldn't be much, but it's something." I stared at him, speechless. It felt like a lifeline, thrown to me just as I was about to go under. Yes, I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I would like that very much." It wasn't a career. It was a handful of hours a week for minimum wage. But it was a start. It was a foothold. That evening, back in my grim little room, I didn't cry. I sat on my lumpy bed, read a poem from my new book, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt a tiny, fragile flicker of hope. I had a job. I had a place, however small, in Port Blossom. I was still Clara. And maybe, just maybe, things could still grow here. The rhythm of my new life in Port Blossom began to establish itself, slowly and quietly, like the turning of the tide in the harbor. My days were measured not by my mother's needs, but by the chiming of the bell on the door of Henderson's pages and the satisfying ache in my muscles from shelving books. Arthur, Mr. Henderson, as I still insisted on calling him, was a man of few but meaningful words. He paid me in cash at the end of each week, a small fold of bills that I would hold in my hand, feeling the weight of my own earnings for the first time in 3 decades. It was a feeling of profound, almost dizzying independence. My work in the bookstore was my anchor. I loved the quiet, dusty atmosphere, the smell of aging paper, the forgotten treasures I'd find tucked away on a bottom shelf, a pressed flower, a faded inscription from a lover, a train ticket from 1952 used as a bookmark. Each book had a history beyond its printed words. I felt a kinship with them, these objects that had been passed from hand to hand, discarded and then found again, their value waiting to be rediscovered. Arthur and I developed a comfortable routine. He would sit at his desk, mending a broken spine with delicate precision, while I sorted and shelved. We'd talk about the books, about the characters as if they were mutual acquaintances. That Elizabeth Bennet, she had a spine of steel, didn't she? He'd muse. Or I always felt for poor Gatsby, reaching for something that was never really there. He never pried into my past, but he had a way of speaking about literature that made it feel like he was speaking about life itself, and I often felt he understood more about me than I ever said aloud. Still, the money from the bookstore was barely enough to cover my rent and the most basic of necessities. The fear of financial ruin was a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of my days. I ate a lot of toast and soup. I darned my socks. I learned to live with a sparseness that bordered on poverty. But it was a poverty I had chosen, and that made all the difference. It was the price of my freedom. One day, while walking home, I saw a help-wanted sign in the window of a small cafe called the Salty Spoon, a local favorite known for its early morning breakfasts for the fishermen. It was for a dishwasher early mornings. The thought of it was daunting, the noise, the heat, the sheer physical labor. But the thought of another small, steady income was more powerful. I walked in, my heart pounding. The owner, a bustling woman named Maria with a warm, flour-dusted face, gave me a skeptical look. "It's a tough job, honey. Starts at 4 a.m. You sure you're up for it?" "I am," I said, with more confidence than I felt. "I'm a hard worker." She looked me up and down, then seemed to see something in my eyes, the desperation, perhaps, or the resolve. "All right," she sighed. "Be here tomorrow at 4. Don't be late." And so my days became a grueling marathon. I would wake at 3:30 in the pitch black, my small room cold around me. I'd walk the silent streets to the Salty Spoon, where I'd spend 4 hours in a cloud of steam, my hands plunged in hot, soapy water, scrubbing pans and plates until my back screamed in protest. It was humbling, exhausting work. At first, my body ached in ways I didn't know were possible. My hands were raw, my feet swollen. But with every plate I washed, I felt like I was scrubbing away the years of helplessness. I was earning my keep. I was surviving. After my shift, I would go back to my room, shower, and collapse on my bed for an hour before heading to the bookstore for the afternoon. My life was work and sleep. There was little room for anything else. The loneliness was a palpable presence, especially in the evenings. I'd sit in my room, eating my simple dinner, and the silence would press in on me. I missed the small comforts of my old life, the softness of my favorite armchair, the familiar weight of my father's quilt, even the mundane drone of the television. I missed having a home. One afternoon at the bookstore, Arthur found me staring out the window, a lost look on my face. "A penny for your thoughts, Clara," he said gently. "They're not worth that much," I replied with a weak smile. "I was just thinking, this room I'm in, it's just a place to sleep. It doesn't feel like a home." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "A home isn't just 4 walls. It's a place where you put down roots. Even a small one. The next day, he came to the store carrying a small, slightly battered terracotta pot. And it was a single, tiny orchid seedling. "I found this at the nursery," he said, placing it in my hands. It looked a bit lonely. "I remembered you mentioning you liked plants once. Thought it might like your windowsill." I stared at the little plant, its two small green leaves reaching for the light. It was the most thoughtful gift I had ever received. It was a piece of my old dream, the one I had buried so deep I thought it had turned to dust. That evening, I placed the pot on the sill of my window that looked out onto the brick wall. It was a tiny speck of life in my barren room. It was a root. Caring for that orchid became my private ritual. I watered it with the careful precision of my old botany training. I made sure it got the few hours of indirect sunlight that bounced off the opposite wall. I talked to it, telling it about my day, about the books I was reading, about the kind man who had given it to me. In a way, I was talking to myself, nurturing the small, fragile part of me that was beginning to grow again. Months passed. Spring turned into a warm, humid summer. My body grew accustomed to the hard work. I was thinner, but stronger. My hands were calloused, but they were my own. I had saved a little money, enough to replace my most worn-out pair of shoes and to buy a small, second-hand reading lamp so I wouldn't have to strain my eyes under the dim light of the single bulb in my room. These small purchases felt like monumental luxuries. I started to know people, or at least their faces. Maria from the cafe would save me a pastry some mornings. The fisherman would nod a "mornin', ma'am," as I arrived for my shift. Customers at the bookstore started to recognize me, asking for my recommendations. I was no longer a complete stranger. I was becoming part of the town's gentle, unassuming tapestry. One Saturday, I saw a notice for volunteers at the Port Blossom Community Garden. On a whim, I went. The garden was a cheerful, chaotic plot of land behind the library, filled with raised beds of vegetables, herbs, and a riot of flowers. It was managed by a woman named Sarah, who had a contagious laugh and dirt permanently lodged under her fingernails. When I told her about my botany background, her eyes lit up. Soon, I was spending every Sunday afternoon at the garden. My hands, which had become so used to soapy water and dusty books, reveled in the feeling of cool, rich soil. I helped prune the roses, diagnose plant diseases, and teach other volunteers how to properly stake tomato plants. All the knowledge I had locked away for 30 years came flooding back. Here, amidst the buzzing bees and the scent of basil and lavender, I felt a spark of my old self, the young woman with dreams of greenhouses. It wasn't a career, but it was a passion rediscovered. One evening, I returned to my room after a long day of work and gardening, tired but with a sense of deep satisfaction. As I watered my orchid, I noticed it. A thin, new stalk was emerging from the base of the plant. A flower spike. It was going to bloom. I stood there for a long time, just looking at it, my heart full. It was just a small plant on a lonely windowsill, but its promise of a flower felt like a validation of my entire journey. I had been uprooted, cast out into the dark, and left to wither. But I hadn't. I had found my own soil, my own light. I had survived. And now I was on the verge of blooming. It was later that week that the phone rang at the bookstore. It was a rare occurrence. Most of Arthur's business was walk-in. He answered, listened for a moment, and then held the receiver out to me, his expression unreadable. "It's for you, Clara," he said. My blood ran cold. No one knew I was here. No one ever called me. "Who is it?" I whispered. "He says his name is Mark," Arthur said softly. "He says he's your brother." The name hit me like a physical blow. For 9 months, I had existed in a world without my family. A world without Eleanor or Mark. And now, with one phone call, that world was about to come crashing in. I took the receiver, my hand trembling, and slowly brought it to my ear. "Hello," I said, and my own voice sounded strange, a voice from a different lifetime. "Clara? Is that really you?" Mark's voice was a strange cocktail of relief and impatience, a sound I knew all too well. It was the voice he used when a problem he'd thought resolved had inconveniently resurfaced. "Yes, Mark." "It's me," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hand. I was intensely aware of Arthur, who was pretending to be busy with a ledger, but was giving me his full, supportive attention from across the desk. "My God, Clara, where have you been?" "We've been worried sick," he exclaimed. The words were right, but the tone was all wrong. It was a perfunctory, box-ticking sort of worry. I pictured him in his sleek office, probably pacing on a plush carpet, annoyed that this call was interrupting his day. "I've been fine," I said, keeping my voice neutral. I would not give him the satisfaction of hearing my struggle. "Fine? You just disappeared. Mom has been a wreck." A pause. I waited. I knew there was a but or an and coming. The real reason for the call. "Listen, Clara, I don't have time for a big family reunion right now. There's a situation. It's Mom." My heart, which had been hammering with anxiety, gave a painful lurch. "What's wrong with her?" "She had a fall. A bad one. Broke her hip," he said, the words coming out in a clipped, efficient summary. "She's at University Hospital. She had surgery this morning. She's been asking for you." The image of my mother, frail and in pain in a hospital bed, flashed in my mind. For a moment, the old instincts, the caregiver's response system honed over decades, kicked in. The urge to drop everything, to run, to be there, was overwhelming. But then I looked around the bookstore. I saw the familiar, comforting chaos of the shelves, the pot with my orchid that I had brought in for the day, Arthur's kind, watchful face. This was my life now. A life I had fought for. Is she going to be all right?" I asked. "The surgery went well," the doctors say. "But the recovery will be long. Months of rehab. She can't go home alone, obviously. The house is a mess, Clara. It's like no one's been cleaning it. And she needs someone. I can't do it. I have my job, my family. You need to come home." It wasn't a question. It was a command. "You need to come home." The same assumption of my role, the same dismissal of my life, as if the last 9 months had been nothing more than a childish tantrum from which I should now be ready to return. A hot surge of anger, clean and clarifying, cut through my fear. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it felt as solid as a rock in my mouth. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "What do you mean, no?" Mark asked, his voice sharp with disbelief. "I mean no, Mark. I am not coming home to become her caregiver again. That life is over. Clara, be reasonable. She's your mother. She's in the hospital, for God's sake. She's asking for you." "She is the one who told me to get out," I said, my voice shaking slightly now with the force of the memory. "She is the one who made it clear I was nothing but a financial burden." "Were you there for that conversation, Mark? Did you hear the words she used? Or did you just provide the financial talking points and then wash your hands of it?" He stammered, caught off guard. She was under a lot of stress. We were just trying to secure her future." "You were securing your inheritance," I shot back, the truth of it finally spoken aloud. "You were trimming the expenses, and I was the biggest one. You can't have it both ways, Mark. You can't cast me out and then summon me back when it's convenient." I could hear him take a deep breath, recalibrating his approach. "Okay, look. I'm sorry. We handled it badly. But this is an emergency. What do you want me to do? I can't just abandon her." "You won't," I said, a strange sense of clarity descending upon me. I was no longer the frightened woman on the bus. I was a person who had learned to solve her own problems. You will hire professional help. You will use the money you were so worried about me costing to pay for a rehabilitation facility and then for in-home nursing care. You will visit her. You will call her. You will be her son." The line was quiet for a long moment. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head as he processed this new, defiant version of his sister. "I can't afford all that indefinitely," he finally said, his voice sullen. "Then you'll have to make some tough decisions, Mark," I said, throwing his own words back at him. "Sell the house if you have to. It's her asset for her care." That was the whole point, wasn't it? I felt a profound shift inside me. I was negotiating from a place of strength, not from a place of desperation. I had nothing to lose because I had already lost everything and survived. "I'll come and visit her," I said, surprising myself. "I will come as her daughter, but not as her employee. My life is here now." I looked at Arthur, who gave me a slow, approving nod. "I will come, but on my own terms." After I hung up, I felt completely drained, as if I had just run a marathon. I sank into the chair opposite Arthur's desk. That, he said, finally breaking the silence, was the sound of a spine of steel. I managed a watery smile. I'm going to go see her. I think you should, he said. But remember what you told him. You're going as her daughter. You're visiting. You're not moving back in. A few days later, I was on a bus heading north, back to Ohio. But this time was different. I had a round-trip ticket in my purse. I had a room and 2 jobs waiting for me in Port Blossom. I had my orchid. I was a visitor, not a supplicant. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and quiet suffering. I found my mother's room and paused at the door. She looked small and impossibly old in the hospital bed, her face pale and etched with pain. And 4 was taped to her hand. She was asleep. I sat in the chair by her bed, the same kind of chair I had sat in for years at countless doctor's appointments. But I felt different. The anger I had felt on the phone with Mark had subsided, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. This was my mother, the woman who had birthed me, who had read me stories, who had, in her own flawed way, loved me before life had made her so afraid. Her eyes flickered open, and for a moment, they were hazy with medication. Then they focused on me. Clara, she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Hello, Mother, I said softly. Tears immediately welled in her eyes and spilled onto her temples, disappearing into her gray hair. You came, she choked out. I came to visit, I clarified gently. She closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. I was so horrible to you, Clara, she whispered. Every day since you left, I've heard my own voice in my head. The things I said, they were monstrous. I didn't say it's okay, because it wasn't. Instead, I just reached out and took her hand. It felt bony and frail. Why? I asked, the question that had haunted me for months. Fear, she said, her voice barely audible. I was so scared, Clara. Scared of running out of money, scared of being old and helpless and alone. Mark kept showing me the numbers, how much everything cost. And you were just there. It was easier to be angry at you than to be angry at the world, at getting old. It was a terrible, cruel thing to do. I drove away the only person who ever truly cared for me. We sat in silence for a long time, my hand holding hers. It wasn't a magical, movie-like absolution. The wounds were too deep for that. But it was a start. It was the truth. I stayed for a week, sleeping on a cot in Mark's guest room. During the day, I went to the hospital. I didn't perform nursing duties. I simply sat with her. I read to her from the newspaper. I told her about Port Blossom, about the bookstore and the garden and the sound of the gulls in the morning. I told her about my orchid. I showed her a picture of it on my cheap, prepaid phone. She looked at the image of the tiny plant and cried again. I worked with Mark, who was chastened and surprisingly cooperative, to arrange for her transfer to a good rehabilitation center. We went through her finances, their finances, and mapped out a plan. Going through the papers in my father's old desk, I found a small, locked metal box. Mark didn't have the key. I've never seen that before, he said. I, however, knew where my father had kept his important keys. I found it in a small dish in his sock drawer. Inside the box was a passbook for a bank account I'd never known about, and a letter addressed to me in my father's familiar, looping handwriting. My hands shook as I unfolded the brittle paper. My dearest Clara, it began. If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have found yourself in a time of need. I have left this for you, and only you. It is separate from everything else. I've been putting money away for you since the day you came home to help us. I knew, even then, the sacrifice you were making. Your mother, she is a good woman, but fear can make her do unwise things. I've told her this is your garden money. It's for you to build your own greenhouse, to finish your studies, to find your own patch of earth and make things grow. It's for you to build a life that is entirely your own. Please use it for that. Do not let your promise to me extinguish the light in you. Your life is just as precious as ours. All my love, Dad. I looked at the passbook. It contained over $80,000. A fortune. A lifeline my father had left for me, a secret kept for decades. A secret my mother, in her fear, had hidden away. I didn't confront her with it in the hospital. It wouldn't have helped. The money wasn't the point anymore. The point was the letter. It was the validation, the love, the permission I had never realized I so desperately needed. My father had seen my sacrifice. He had known. On my last day, I sat with my mother one final time before I left for the bus station. I found Dad's letter, I said quietly. She didn't feign ignorance. She just nodded, her eyes full of a deep, abiding shame. I was going to give it to you, she whispered. But the fear. I thought I would need it. I was wrong. I was so wrong, Clara. That money is yours. It always was. I know, I said. And for the first time, I felt a genuine stirring of forgiveness. Not for her, but for myself. Forgiveness for the years I had lost, and the permission to finally, fully, live the ones I had left. I returned to Port Blossom not as a refugee, but as a woman of means. The $80,000 felt like an astronomical sum. But the life I had built on minimum wage had taught me the value of every dollar and the value of a life not measured by money. I didn't quit my jobs. I still loved the quiet of the bookstore, the satisfying work in the garden. But I did use the money to do what my father had wished. I didn't build a giant greenhouse. Instead, I rented a small cottage with a sunroom and a patch of overgrown land. A place that was truly a home. In the sunroom, my little orchid, now in full, glorious bloom, had pride of place amongst dozens of new plants. The backyard, I slowly began to transform into my own private garden, my own patch of earth. I still talk to my mother. She is in a long-term care facility now, paid for by her own assets, including the sale of the house. Mark visits her. I call every Sunday. Our conversations are quiet, sometimes a little sad, but they are real. The bitterness is gone, replaced by a fragile, late-in-life understanding. Sometimes, when I am in my garden, my hands in the dirt, the warm Carolina sun on my back, I think about that final dinner. I think about the cruelty and the pain. And I feel a strange sense of gratitude. My mother's harsh words, meant to break me, had instead set me free. They had forced me out of a life that was slowly suffocating me and pushed me toward a future I had to build for myself from the ground up. She yelled for me to get out. So I did. And in doing so, I finally, at 58 years old, found my way home. The package arrived on a Tuesday, an ordinary day that had, until that moment, been filled with the quiet hum of my new life. It was a large, clumsily taped cardboard box left on the porch of my little cottage in Port Blossom. The return address was my mother's old house in Ohio, the handwriting unmistakably my brother Mark's. My heart did a slow, complicated tumble in my chest. For the better part of a year, I had worked so hard to build a life here, a life separate from that address, from that past. To see it appear on my doorstep felt like a ghost had come to call. My name is Clara, and not so long ago, my world was appended in a single, brutal evening. Now my days were my own, measured by the salt on the breeze and the scent of damp earth from my burgeoning garden. The cottage I rented was small, but every corner of it was mine. The sunroom was a veritable jungle, a testament to a passion I had reclaimed, with my very first orchid, the one from Arthur, holding court in the center, its blooms a proud, defiant purple. My father's inheritance had given me security, but it was the work, the pre-dawn shifts at the Salty Spoon and the dusty, peaceful afternoons at Henderson's Pages that had given me back my sense of self. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the box. Part of me wanted to push it back into the mail carrier's hands, to write return to sender and refuse this intrusion from another life. But curiosity and a deeper, more tangled feeling of connection won out. I dragged the box inside, the scraping sound loud in my quiet kitchen. With a pair of scissors from the drawer, I slit the tape. Inside, nestled amongst packing peanuts, were fragments of my former existence. Not the grand, important things, but the small, forgotten pieces. A box of my father's old gardening tools, their wooden handles worn smooth by his touch. A stack of photo albums, their padded covers smelling of dust and time. And at the very bottom, my mother's silver music box, the one that played a tinkling, slightly off-key rendition of Clair de Lune. A note from Mark was tucked inside. "Clara," it read, "found these while clearing out the attic. Thought you should have them. Mom is stable. Hope you're well. Mark." I sank onto a kitchen chair. The contents of the box spread around me like archaeological finds from a buried city. I picked up one of my father's tools, a hand trowel. I could feel the ghost of his grip in the worn wood, see the faint traces of Ohio soil still clinging to the metal. A wave of grief, so pure and sharp it stole my breath, washed over me. This wasn't just a tool, it was a connection to him, to the man whose quiet love had reached across death to give me this new life. Then I opened a photo album. There I was, a little girl with scraped knees, holding up a fistful of dandelions for the camera. There was my father, younger than I could ever remember him, smiling, his arm around my mother, who looked radiant and full of hope. And then, the later photos. The family gatherings where I stood slightly apart, my smile a little tighter, the light in my eyes a little dimmer with each passing year. It was the slow, photographic evidence of my own erasure. The weekly phone calls to my mother at the care facility were a delicate dance. We spoke of the weather, of the food, of the other residents. We never spoke of the past. It was a fragile truce, an unspoken agreement to build something new on the rubble of what we had destroyed. But holding these objects in my hands, I realized that the past wasn't something you could simply wall off. It was part of the soil from which the present grew. That evening, Arthur from the bookstore came over for dinner, a weekly tradition we had started. He found me sitting on my porch, the silver music box in my lap. I had wound it up, and its tinny, imperfect melody drifted into the twilight air. He sat in the chair beside me, not speaking, just listening until the music wound down. "A sound from a long time ago," he said, his voice gentle. "My mother's," I told him. "My brother sent a box of things from the house." He nodded, understanding without my needing to explain the complicated emotions churning inside me. Arthur had a way of doing that. Our friendship had deepened over the months into something quiet and precious. We were two people who had lived long lives, who had known love and loss, and we found a comfortable harbor in each other's company. There was no pretense between us. "Sometimes," he said, looking out at the fireflies beginning to flicker in my garden, "the things we leave behind don't stay behind. They follow us, to remind us of who we were, so we can see how far we've come." I thought about that all week. I took my father's tools out to my garden and used them to plant a new bed of roses. As my hands, now strong and calloused from my own hard work, held the same tools he had held, I felt a sense of continuity, of a legacy being honored. I wasn't just Clara, the woman who had started over. I was my father's daughter, a person who made things grow. The photos I put away, not to be forgotten, but to be looked at later, when the memories they held were less like open wounds and more like old, familiar scars. Life settled back into its comfortable rhythm. My mornings were filled with the clatter of dishes and Maria's boisterous laughter at the cafe. My afternoons were for the hushed reverence of the bookstore. My evenings and weekends were for my garden and the quiet companionship of Arthur. I was, for the first time in my adult life, content. But contentment, I was learning, is a season. And seasons change. The change began one Thursday afternoon. The bookstore was quiet, a soft rain tapping against the windows. Arthur was at his desk, looking at a stack of official-looking papers, a deep line etched between his brows. He looked older than I had ever seen him, and weary. "Is everything all right, Mr. Henderson?" I asked, using the formal name I still clung to out of habit. He sighed, a long, heavy sound. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Clara, please, after all this time, call me Arthur." He paused. "And no, I suppose everything is not all right. Or perhaps it is, depending on how you look at it." He gestured to the chair opposite his desk, the same one I had sunk into the day I had first told him my story. "My doctor has been at me for a year," he began, his voice low. "My heart isn't what it used to be. Nothing dire, not yet. But he says the stress of running a business, even a quiet one like this, is too much. He wants me to retire." The word retire hung in the air between us. Henderson's pages without Arthur was unimaginable. The store was an extension of him. It was his heart and soul made manifest in paper and ink. And I think, he continued, looking around the beloved clutter of his store, I think he might be right. I'm tired, Clara. The passion is still there, but the energy is not. So you'll close? I whispered, a cold dread creeping into my heart. This place had been my sanctuary, my first port in the storm. The thought of its doors being locked for good was devastating. I don't want to, he said, his voice thick with emotion. This place, it has been my life's work. My wife, Eleanor, a different Eleanor, he added with a small, sad smile, she loved the store as much as I did. Closing it would feel like letting her go all over again. He looked at me, his gaze direct and heavy. I have to sell it. I've had an offer from a developer. They want the location. They'd gut it, of course. Turn it into another chain coffee shop or a souvenir store. The image was a sacrilege. To turn this haven of stories into something so sterile and commercial felt like a physical blow. Port Blossom would lose a piece of its soul. I would lose the place that had saved me. When? I asked. I have to decide soon, he said. Within the month. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my sunroom, surrounded by my plants, the moon casting long shadows on the floor. My father's words from his letter echoed in my mind. It's for you to build your own greenhouse, to find your own patch of earth and make things grow. I had my garden, my patch of earth. But Henderson's Pages was also a place where things grew, ideas, dreams, a sense of belonging. It was the place where I had started to grow again. The next day, as if the world was conspiring to test me, I learned of another threat. At the community garden, Sarah, the energetic manager, called a meeting. The city council, she announced, was considering a proposal to sell the public land the garden was on. A developer wanted to build luxury condos. It was the same story, a different verse. The small, unique, life-giving spaces of our town were being threatened by the relentless march of generic progress. First Arthur's store, now this place of community and sustenance. I looked around at the faces of the other volunteers, retirees, young families, people who, like me, found peace and purpose with their hands in the dirt. I saw the same fear and outrage in their eyes that I felt in my own heart. I felt caught between two impending losses. The bookstore was my personal refuge. The garden was my public passion. Both were integral to the new life I had so carefully constructed. And both were about to be erased. That week, I walked around in a fog of anxiety. At the bookstore, the silence felt heavy with impending doom. With Arthur, a new formality had sprung up between us, the unspoken reality of the sale forming a wall. My contentment had evaporated, replaced by the familiar, cold grip of helplessness. I had the money. The thought was a constant, nagging whisper. My father's $80,000 sat in a bank account, a secret arsenal I hadn't known how to deploy. It had seemed like a fortune, enough to secure my own small future. But was it enough to save a piece of the world I had come to love? And even if it was, what was I supposed to do? Make an offer on a bookstore I had no idea how to run? Start a campaign to save a garden against a wealthy developer? I was Clara, the former caregiver, the dishwasher, the part-time bookshelver. Who was I to take on such battles? One evening, I called my mother. I didn't plan to tell her any of this, but as she asked her usual questions about my week, the story just tumbled out, about Arthur, the store, the garden, the developers. I told her about the helpless feeling, the fear of losing the fragile world I had built. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I expected a platitude, or perhaps an "I told you so" disguised as concern. Instead, what she said stunned me. Your father, she began, her voice raspy but clear. He wasn't a fighter. Not in the loud way. But when he believed in something, like his garden, or like you, he was the most stubborn man on earth. He didn't fight with fists, he fought with patience. He would plant a tree and tend it for 20 years just to prove a point. He'd find a way. She paused. That money he left you, he called it your garden money. Maybe it's not just for your garden, Clara. Maybe it's for any garden that needs tending. After we hung up, I sat on my porch, holding the cold, silent music box. He would find a way. The words settled deep inside me. For 30 years, I had put everyone else's needs before my own. I had tended my mother's life, my father's health, their house. Then, in Port Blossom, I had started tending to my own needs. Now, for the first time, I felt a pull to tend to something larger than myself. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. But beneath it, a new feeling was taking root. It felt like resolve. It felt like my father's stubbornness. I didn't know what the right path was, or if I was strong enough to walk it. But I knew I couldn't stand by and watch the world I had fought so hard to find be paved over. The next morning, I woke up with a decision. I walked into Henderson's Pages, my heart pounding, not as an employee, but as someone with a proposal. I was going to fight. I was going to find a way. I found Arthur behind the counter, a stack of books waiting to be priced, but his hands were still, his gaze lost somewhere in the dusty middle distance. The bookstore, which had always felt like a living entity, seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a verdict. My own breath was shallow, my palms damp. I had rehearsed what I was going to say 100 times, but now, faced with the reality of it, the words felt flimsy and foolish. "Arthur," I said, my voice coming out stronger than I expected. He looked up, his eyes tired but kind. "Clara," he acknowledged, a faint, sad smile on his lips. "I've been thinking about the store," I began, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "And about what you said. About it being your life's work and your wife's. It's not just a building, Arthur. It's a legacy." He nodded slowly. "That it is. A legacy I'm about to sell for scrap." "Don't," I said, the word a plea. "Don't sell it to them. Sell it to me." The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the gentle ticking of the old clock on the wall. Arthur stared at me, his expression shifting from surprise to confusion, and then to a deep, searching curiosity. "Clara," he said gently, "this is a business. It requires capital. I appreciate the sentiment, I truly do, but you work 2 jobs just to make ends meet." It was the moment of truth. The moment to reveal the secret I had guarded so closely. "I have some money," I said, my voice dropping. "My father left me an inheritance. He called it my garden money. Enough to make a serious offer." I watched as he processed this, his intelligent eyes taking in the full measure of what I was proposing. He saw not just the financial offer, but the emotional one. He saw a woman who had been given a second chance offering to pay it forward to the place that had given it to her. "And what would you do with it?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Run it all by yourself?" "It's more than just shelving books, Clara. It's ordering, accounts, taxes. It's a 7-day-a-week monster, even on the quiet days." "I wouldn't run it alone," I said, taking another leap of faith. "I would want a partner. Someone who knows the business inside and out. Someone who loves it as much as I do." I let the words hang in the air. "I'm not asking you to keep working, Arthur. I'm asking you not to leave. Be my partner. Let me handle the physical work, the day-to-day operations you find so draining. You can manage the ordering, the accounts, from home if you need to. You can be the heart of it, and I can be the hands and feet. We could save it together." A flicker of something I hadn't seen in weeks sparked in his eyes, a flicker of hope. He was quiet for a long time, looking from me to the book-lined walls and back again. "My Eleanor," he said softly, "she always said this place needed new blood to keep it alive. She would have liked you, Clara. She would have liked you very much." He took a deep breath. "Let me see your numbers. We'll talk to the lawyers. No promises. But let's talk." Leaving the bookstore that day, I felt lightheaded, terrified, and more alive than I had ever been. I had laid all my cards on the table, but the battle was only half fought. The community garden still loomed large in my mind. I couldn't buy the land myself. Even my father's generous gift wasn't enough for that. But my mother's words about my father's patience gave me another idea. I went to the library and spent hours researching city ordinances and zoning laws. I contacted a local environmental group. I spoke with Sarah and the other gardeners, and together, we formulated a plan. We wouldn't fight the developers with money because we couldn't win that fight. We would fight them with community. We organized. We started a Save Port Blossom Garden Committee. My years of managing a household, of juggling appointments and budgets, had given me organizational skills I never knew I possessed. I helped draft petitions. I coordinated volunteer schedules for a public awareness campaign. We stood outside the grocery store, collecting signatures. We went door to door, explaining what the garden meant to the town, not just as a source of fresh produce for families and the local food bank, but as a green space, a meeting place, a classroom for children. For the first time, I was a public person. I spoke at a town hall meeting, my voice shaking, but my words firm. I stood at a podium and told them my story. I told them how this town, this bookstore, and this garden had saved me when I had nothing. I told them that a town's soul isn't in its tax revenue or its new condos, but in the places that nurture its people. As I spoke, I saw Arthur in the audience, his face beaming with a pride that made my heart swell. I was no longer just Clara, the quiet woman who shelved books. I was a voice for this community I had adopted, or that had, perhaps, adopted me. News of our campaign reached my brother, Mark. He called me one evening, his tone a mixture of awe and confusion. "I saw an article online," he said, "with your picture. You're leading a protest." "I'm leading a community initiative." I corrected him gently. "Right," he said. "Well, good for you, Clara. Seriously, it's impressive." Then, a change in his voice. "Listen, I'm coming down for a visit next month. If that's okay, I'd like to see all this. Your new life." The offer was tentative, respectful. It was a world away from the demanding tone he'd used when he'd summoned me to my mother's bedside. "I'd like that, Mark," I said, and I meant it. The day of the final city council vote on the garden, the meeting hall was packed. Our campaign had been successful in rallying the town. One by one, residents stood up to speak. And then, to my astonishment, Arthur stood up. He spoke about how the garden and the bookstore were two sides of the same coin, places where things took root and grew. He announced to the council and the entire town his decision to refuse the developer's offer and to instead enter into a partnership with me, ensuring Henderson's pages would remain a part of Port Blossom's future. The room erupted in applause. In the end, the council, facing overwhelming public support for the garden, voted to designate it as a protected community green space. We had won. We had fought with patience and passion, and we had won. A few weeks later, Mark arrived. I met him at the small bus station. He looked different, less severe. The lines of stress around his eyes softened. He looked at me, really looked at me, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Wow, Clara," he said. "You look happy." I showed him my life. My little cottage, my riotous garden. I took him to the Salty Spoon, where Maria enveloped him in a loud, welcoming hug. And then I took him to the bookstore. On the front door, a new, hand-painted sign hung beneath the old one. It read, "Henderson's Pages. Arthur Henderson and Clara Gardner, proprietors." Mark stared at the sign, then at me. "Gardner," he asked. "You changed your name?" "No," I smiled. "I reclaimed it. It was my father's mother's name. It seemed fitting." Inside, Arthur greeted him warmly. As they shook hands, I saw my brother finally understand. He saw that I hadn't just run away. I had built something. I wasn't the dependent sister he had to worry about or manage. I was a business owner, a community leader, a person in her own right. Before he left, we sat on my porch, just as Arthur and I so often did. "I talked to Mom," he said. I told her about the store. She said Dad would have been so proud of you. He cleared his throat, looking away. She was right. I am too. I'm sorry, Clara. For everything. The apology, so long in coming, was quiet and sincere. It didn't erase the past, but it soothed the scar. We all did the best we could with what we knew at the time, I said, offering a grace I had only recently found for myself. My new life is not a fairy tale. It is real and tangible and sometimes very difficult. There are days when the accounts don't balance, when a late frost threatens my garden, when the ache in my back from a long day reminds me I am no longer young. But it is a life of my own making. Arthur and I run the bookstore as partners in every sense of the word. Our companionship has deepened into a quiet, steadfast love, a comfort in the evening of our lives. My garden thrives. My friendship with Maria and Sarah and the others is a rich tapestry of support. Sometimes, late at night, when the store is quiet, I'll take out my mother's silver music box and wind it up. Its tinny, imperfect melody will fill the space, a sound from a different lifetime. It no longer sounds sad to me. It sounds like a prelude to the unexpected, beautiful, and resilient second act of a life I once thought was over. I was a woman who was told to get out. So I did. And I walked right into the life that was waiting for me all along. The seasons in Port Blossom had a gentleness I'd never known in Ohio. They didn't arrive with a clash of thunder or a blanket of ice. They simply bled into one another, a soft watercolor painting of change. 2 years had passed since I had become a co-owner of Henderson's Pages. 2 years of sunrises at the Salty Spoon, of afternoons surrounded by stories, of evenings spent with my hands in the rich soil of my own garden. My life had found a rhythm that felt as natural and steady as the tides. My name is Clara Gardner, and this was the life I had built, not from a blueprint, but from the salvaged pieces of a life that had been shattered. The cottage was no longer just a rental. It was a home, filled with the scent of baking bread and blooming orchids. The partnership with Arthur had blossomed into a deep and abiding love, a quiet companionship that was the anchor of my days. We were two old trees, our roots now intertwined, providing shade and comfort for one another. My relationship with my brother, Mark, had transformed, rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect and a shared, quiet grief for the family we had once been. The phone rang on a crisp autumn morning. I was in the sunroom, repotting a fern, my hands covered in dirt. It was Mark. I no longer felt a jolt of fear when he called. But this time, his voice was different. It wasn't the impatient baritone of the past, nor the tentative respect of his recent visits. It was low and heavy with a sorrow I knew intimately. "Clara," he said, and I could hear the weariness in his voice. "It's Mom. The doctors say it's time. A few days, maybe a week. She's comfortable. She's not in any pain. But she's asking for you. Time." The word hung in the air, so final, so absolute. I closed my eyes, picturing my mother. Not the angry, fearful woman at the dining room table, but the small, frail figure I had last seen in the hospital, her hand in mine. "I'll be on the next bus," I said, my voice calm. There was no hesitation. This was not a command I was obeying, but a choice I was making. When I told Arthur, he simply wrapped his arms around me. "Go," he said, his voice a warm rumble against my ear. "Say what needs to be said. Your home will be here, waiting for you when you get back." He pressed a small, worn copy of Leaves of Grass into my hand. "For the journey," he whispered. The bus ride north was a reverse pilgrimage. I wasn't fleeing this time. I was returning, whole and strong, to face the final chapter of my old life. Mark met me at the station. He hugged me, a real hug, not the awkward, clumsy embrace of our past. We were two orphans now, standing on the precipice of a world without parents. The care facility was quiet, filled with the hushed sounds of lives winding down. My mother's room was dim. She was asleep, her breathing shallow. She looked peaceful, a translucent quality to her skin. The fierce, frightened woman who had hurled such cruel words at me was gone. In her place was just my mother. I sat with her for hours, holding her hand, the same way I had done for my father. Mark sat with me. We didn't talk much. We just shared the space, the silence, the waiting. Later that evening, her eyes flickered open. They were clear, lucid. They found me, and a faint smile touched her lips. "Clara," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "I knew you'd come." "I'm here, Mom," I said, squeezing her hand. She looked at me, her gaze holding a lifetime of unspoken things. "I'm not scared anymore, Clara," she said, her voice gaining a surprising bit of strength. All those years, I was so afraid. Of being alone, of having nothing. And my fear made me a monster. I built walls to keep myself safe, but I just locked myself in and pushed you out. Tears streamed down my face, hot and silent. "I know," I whispered. "The greatest treasure I ever had," she continued, her gaze unwavering, "was your love. Your loyalty." And I threw it away for numbers on a page. It was the worst bargain a person could ever make. Her eyes drifted to the small table beside her bed, where the silver music box sat. Mark must have brought it. That's for you, she said. It always should have been. I looked at the box, then back at her. The anger, the resentment, the years of pain, they felt distant now, like a story I had read about someone else. All I felt was a profound, heartbreaking love for this complicated, dying woman who had given me life. I forgive you, Mom, I said, and the words were a release, not just for her, but for me. For everything. I forgive you. A single tear rolled down her cheek. Thank you, she breathed. She was quiet for a long time, her eyes closed. I thought she had fallen asleep, but then she spoke again, her voice dreamy, distant. Do you remember, she murmured, when you were a little girl? On summer nights, we'd sit on the back porch and you would chase the lightning bugs. You'd catch them in a jar, your face so full of wonder. You never kept them. You always let them go before we went inside. The memory was so vivid, so pure. It was from a time before the bitterness, before the fear. A memory of a young mother and her child sharing a moment of simple magic. I remember, I choked out. You were always so good at letting things go, she whispered. Her breathing slowed and her hand relaxed in mine. And just like that, she was gone. She had let go too. Mark and I handled the arrangements together as partners. We went through her few remaining belongings, a small collection of trinkets and memories. We found a small, beautiful photograph of our parents on their wedding day, and we each took a copy. In the shared task, in our shared grief, the last of the distance between us dissolved. We were brother and sister again. When I finally returned to Port Blossom, stepping off the bus into the salty air, it was a true homecoming. Arthur was there to meet me, his presence a comforting beacon. He didn't press me for details. He just held my hand all the way back to my cottage. My home was just as I had left it, the sunroom green and vibrant, the air smelling of life. It felt like my own personal Eden. That evening, Arthur came over. He didn't bring food or wine. He brought a small pot with a single, unfamiliar seedling in it. He placed it on the table between us. I thought your garden needed a new resident, he said softly. I smiled, a real, deep smile. It's beautiful. What is it? It's a sapling, he said. From a ginkgo tree. They're resilient. They can live for 1,000 years. He looked at me, his kind eyes full of a love that needed no grand pronouncements. I was thinking, he said, his voice a little unsteady, that this cottage is lovely. And your garden is a masterpiece. But maybe there's room for one more old tree to put down roots here. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple gold band. He didn't get on one knee. He didn't make a speech. He just gently took my hand, the one with dirt still under the nails, and looked at me. Clara Gardner, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I have loved you from the moment you taught me how to properly sort poetry. Will you build this garden with me for whatever time we have left? Tears of a different kind, tears of pure, unadulterated joy, welled in my eyes. I thought of the lonely, terrified woman who had arrived in this town with nothing but a few $100s and a broken heart. I thought of the journey, the struggle, the rediscovery. I had been given a second chance at life, and now a second chance at love. Yes, I whispered. Oh, yes, Arthur. 1,000 times yes. Today, I am 61 years old. The sign on the bookstore still reads Henderson's Pages. Arthur Henderson and Clara Gardner, proprietors. My husband, and how my heart sings at that word, and I still run it together. My mornings are my own now. A bright young woman from the community garden has taken my place at the Salty Spoon. My hands are still in the dirt every day, tending the garden we are building together. On my windowsill, the silver music box sits. Every now and then I wind it up. Its tinkling, imperfect melody fills the room, a sweet, distant echo of a past I have made peace with. It is not a sound of sadness or regret. It is a reminder that sometimes the most painful endings are just the beginning of a new, unforeseen, and beautiful story. My mother yelled at me to get out of her house, to get out of her life. She thought she was casting me into the darkness, but all she did was force me to turn and face the sun. She told me to get out, and in doing so, she gave me the whole world.